Many thanks to Skillshare, the generous sponsors of this video. Hello and thanks for joining me for some more landscape photography. And today I've brought you along to the Slate Quarry at Dinorwig near Llanberis in Snowdonia. Now, as you can probably tell from the low-hanging cloud behind me, conditions aren't necessarily ideal, and I'll have to apologise if you hear the drone of the rescue helicopter just over on Snowdon. I think an unfortunate walker is being hauled off as we speak. Now, I've brought you to Dinorwig for three very good reasons. The first reason is that despite the fact this is video number 174 on my channel, I've never actually done a video from Dinorwig itself. I've been right up at the very top galleries and taken some shots when I took you to the summit of Eryri around about this time last year, I think, something like that. But despite the fact I've come here with the video camera, every single time I've set up to talk to you, something's cropped up and I've ended up abandoning the video. So let's hope this one works out a little bit better. So that's reason number one. Now, reason number two is that I wanted to celebrate our new UNESCO World Heritage status in the Slate landscape of Northwest Wales. That was announced quite recently. I'll put a couple of links in the notes below, one to the UNESCO site webpage itself, so that you can have a look at why they think it's a World Heritage site. Also, there's a series of maps there. It doesn't just consist of Dinorwig, but I suppose the likes of this slate quarry, because of its scale, and also it's quite accessible. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. But it's kind of the epicenter of the slate landscape. There are actually 6 locations designated by UNESCO. There's Dinorwig and its close cousin Penrhyn, which is pretty much cutting into the opposite side of the very same mountain. And also the transport links, so the links from Penrhyn Quarry down to the coast at Bangor, and also Penrhyn Castle, which was built off the profits from the slate quarrying, along with exploitation of the workers. There's also the, obviously, as you can imagine, the Blaenau area. Blaenau itself actually isn't in the national park. It's kind of the hole in the middle of the polo mint, but it's designated as part of the World Heritage Site. The transport links down to the quayside at Porthmadog, where the slate was exported from. Also a couple of more minor locations, but very interesting, and if you're a landscape photographer, certainly something you'd probably want to check out. There's the Nancle Valley with the Dorothea quarry. Also a little known one at Cwm which is kind of on the southern flank of Moel Hebog, and that's quite an interesting location, obviously with a lake as well at Cwm. So lots to explore. And one of the things that I was particularly pleased about is that it really does, as a location for landscape photographers, put this part of the United Kingdom firmly on the map. So that's the first 2 reasons. Now there's a third reason, but I'll come on to that in a little while. I'm going to have to head down into the lower parts of the quarry because I've come in at the mid-level through Dinorwig village. You can also access it down at the bottom through Llanberis, or from the very top if you walk around the flank of Eryri. But because of the low cloud, and it's pretty much constantly drizzling with heavier rain in between, so what I'm going to do is head down into the tree line down at the lower levels. Now, if you follow my channel for any length of time, you'll know that when I'm out in the mountains with my camera, it's kind of counterintuitive for me to head downhill rather than uphill. But today it was definitely the right move, and I'm taking advantage of coming below the tree line and sheltering under some fabulous old oak trees, and the rain has pretty much set in for the moment. I have grabbed a couple of stills along the way down, and hopefully with the footage I've got and with those, you'll get a flavour of the atmosphere of this place, because bright sunny days can be quite few and far between. More often than not, these are the sort of conditions you'll be faced with. And that brings me quite nicely onto the third reason I wanted to bring you along with me today to Dinorwig. And that was, I wanted to empathise with visitors who can't really control when they come here. Now, I've got the advantage of looking out of my window and going, ooh, nice conditions, jump in the car. 25 minutes later, I'm on site and I'm ready to get going with the photography. But of course, if you visit this area from elsewhere and you have to plan in advance, when you get here, you kind of get what you're given. So what I wanted to try and do today, whether or not I'll pull it off remains to be seen, but what I wanted to do was to kind of just grab a couple of hours and come out here, whatever the conditions, and see what I can achieve with it. And hopefully I'm putting myself more closely in your shoes, because to be honest with you, on a day like this, normally I probably would be elsewhere. Although that said, we have been treated to some quite dramatic cloud. So that's an advantage, because when I came out, it was absolutely flat grey. There was nothing to see at all. So it was really a photography nightmare in that respect. So even though the conditions aren't ideal for what I would pick, I'm working with what you might have if you came to visit. So let's see what I can do with it. Well, now at least the rain seems to have eased off a little bit from tipping down to a steady drizzle, but at least I can make a quick piece to camera for you without the risk of my Osmo Pocket getting drenched. As you can see behind me, I've come down to a rather famous location in the quarry called Anglesey Barracks. This is a street of cottages where men from Anglesey who worked in the quarry during the week used to live before heading back for the odd day and a half at weekends to see their families, and that's pretty much all they got. It was a really tough life. Now, whilst there are quite wide areas of the quarry which are fenced off for safety reasons, and far be it from me to suggest there are one or two really good photography locations in the restricted areas. That said, there are plenty of marked trails right the way through the quarry, so if you come to visit, you're perfectly safe having a walk around, and you'll certainly get a really good feel for the place from the public areas. Now the barracks is in the lower half of the quarry, below the tree line. Where we came in further up, as you probably saw, there's absolutely no major tree growth at all. But down here, since it became abandoned, we're now ringed by mature oaks and ash trees, and in better light, they can be really interesting to the photographer. Now I'm up at a vantage point on a rocky bluff that overlooks the roof level of the cottages down here. And you've probably seen this photograph a million times before, where a photographer positions himself quite centrally, because this bluff is right in the middle of the street line, and gets both lines of cottages going down either side of the image to the vanishing point of the gateway at the end. Now, I don't see any problem with that if there's interesting light, if there's interesting sky, and sometimes people will use the trees around to create a sort of framing effect. However, one of the problems that I do have with that particular composition is that the bulk of it, the central area, is the street itself, which is just a big rectangular slab of grass. And very often there's nothing much to see. So what I've done, just as an experiment really, is I've just shot one side of the street, put that more centrally in the composition so that it is more featured. But it's fair to say that it doesn't really put the location in any sort of context. So what I'm going to do now is head on down in, see if I can find something a little bit more interesting. The light isn't very good, so it's going to be all about the composition. Now, when Skillshare got in touch and said, would I be interested in them sponsoring a video, I was really flattered, because I've been a premium member of Skillshare for quite some time. It's great value for money, and you get access to thousands of creative classes. Now, a Skillshare membership means that you've got full access to everything they have to offer, all sorts of really interesting and creative skills. Of course, photography and video production. I'm currently taking a class by Thomas Frank in media productivity. It's really interesting. Plus, you get to interact with other people taking the class and the tutor. But there are topics ranging from fine art and music to technical skills like web development and UX design. So there's bound to be something there that you'll find interesting. And the first 1,000 people who use the link in the description below will get a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. So what I wanted to do with this shot was to really capture the atmosphere of the barracks, but I also want to put it in some context. So I particularly like that the ragwort is in full bloom here down in the old street, but I also wanted that glimpse of the backdrop, because the shot from up on the top there, whilst it gives you a really interesting view of the entire barracks themselves and works really well in evening light or golden hour, for this sort of shot, I wanted to try and pick out a little bit more detail to compensate for the fact that the light really isn't that attractive. So, in between tourists wandering through and meandering about in front of me, I've weighted it out and I think I've got the shot. Now, today's photography really isn't much to do with exposure. It couldn't be simpler. The light is quite flat and not at all challenging. However, what is challenging, as always, is composition. What I wanted to do was to run the divide between the grass and the slate front of the cottages into the bottom right hand corner. I also wanted to make sure that I could get the path snaking through the composition. I needed the camera high up enough so that I can see the flank of Gliddervald in the background with the cap of cloud on the top of it. So if I was down any lower, I can't see over the wall to Gliddervald. The other thing that I've done very deliberately is, having tried getting in close to the nearest ragwort and shooting really wide, the problem with that is it minimises that backdrop, and I didn't want to do that. So I've backed up a little bit and I've zoomed in at 35mm, so a full frame equivalent of 70mm. And by doing that, I tend to pull the composition in together, and hopefully nothing sort of falls away and gets minimised in it. Well, now I'm back sheltering under that oak tree where I spoke to you earlier. It's really closed in on me. I was fortunate to have about 45 minutes between showers to talk to you at the barracks. And I was just kind of thinking about clocking out. Bit unfortunate really, because my last couple of videos were quite truncated due to conditions. Nevertheless, I have actually spotted something, and it's probably quite an unusual composition for me. I was looking across at the slate galleries on the far side of the quarry, and there's some quite nice colour on the levels because the heather is in full bloom and it's just that sort of time of year. And I thought, oh, that's quite nice. And then I spotted that it was being framed by this fabulous oak tree, which you can't help but love an oak tree, and it's absolutely covered in fabulous moss. So completely contrary to what I was saying earlier about today not really being about exposure, this one very much is. The composition is quite straightforward. I've got a bit of rocky foreground on this spoil heap that I'm standing on, and then I've got a nice angle of trees coming down, and then behind that, mirroring it, another angle of the face of one of the levels, a row of heather on top of that, and then some low hanging cloud, and just a few profiles of the quarry galleries in the distance appearing out of the clag. So that's what caught my eye. The complication for this is the exposure. I'm shooting it at 14mm because I really want that framing for the tree, and I want to capture the beautiful moss that's on these branches as they all lead the eye through to the scene in the distance. So what that's meant is I've had to shoot it at a whole series of exposure values to make sure I've got enough to work with in post. So I've shot it all manually. I don't bracket when I'm on a tripod because I can be more cerebral about it. But I've overexposed quite dramatically so that the dark branches, which to the eye are almost silhouettes, but they are catching some side light, and I want to pick out some of those details in the moss in post-production. And then of course, contrary to the tree, the background sky, even though it's a grim grey day, is really bright. Then I've had to dial the exposure right down so that I don't overexpose the sky, and of course what that means is that the tree itself then, and the leaves and the branches above at the top end of the frame, are pretty much silhouettes, and I don't want that either, because the light being reflected, or diffused I should say, through the clouds is sort of backlighting some of these leaves, and I want that effect in the final image. So it's going to be a complicated bit of processing. In fact, it might even warrant a processing video. Don't do those very often, but if that's something you'd like to see, of course, I don't know how this image is going to turn out. So if I stick it up at the end and it's pants, I won't be demonstrating how I processed it. But nevertheless, I'm reasonably confident that, you know, I kind of know what I'm doing these days. So yeah, 4 or 5 exposures. I think it'll make a composition. It looks good to the eye, but that doesn't always necessarily translate into a good photograph. We'll have to wait and see. I have grabbed a few more handhelds across the valley. We had some really nice dramatic cloud. One thing that I do sometimes is I change the output display on my camera. So it helps me to visualize how a final image might look. So I was looking at it through 16:9, quite letterbox, and in fact I might even bring it in tighter than that, almost a sort of cinemascope. It's a still, but I had a fabulous line of cloud and I had to grab it because just a little bit of light came through and I didn't have time to set you up and talk to you about it. Anyway, I'm not sure there's anything else to be had, but let's have another nose about. Well, I've had a hunt round and to be honest with you, I've come up blank. So I'm hopeful that what I've shown you is that even if you come here and conditions are rubbish, you can still enjoy some photography. Hopefully I've given you an idea or two, but at the very least, you can come and enjoy an absolutely jaw-dropping landscape, one that rightly deserves UNESCO World Heritage status in my completely unbiased opinion. So I'm going to leave it there for this one. Thank you ever so much for coming along with me. I really hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, why not subscribe now and join me next time. Cheers.